Okay, good. So I'm the next speaker, and this is a joint work with Diana Mazzarella. We are both from the University of Neuchâtel, and this work is Redescribing early pragmatics. So in this talk, we want to target two specific problems that revolves around the broader developmental challenge, which is taken in this symposium. The first one is what we call the ostension problem. How do infants understand and represent ostension? So there are some theories in the literature, the so-called minimalist theories of early communication, that, for example, emphasize the attention manipulation function of ostension, or that we have here from the previous perspective by Nima, that emphasize the non-naturally marking function of ostensive signals in early ontogeny. And we think that these strategies provide some interesting way to simplify the cognitive and representational requirements for ostensive communication in infancy. However, we also think that these theories tend to overlook a related and equally important problem. So as has been remarked recently by Pusculus, in general, minimalist theories of early communication tend to miss a truly developmental perspective on the matter, because they assume that mature communication, adult communication, on the other hand, can rely on more complex mentalistic representation, while hypothesizing simpler models and explanation and representation for infant communication. However, these minimalist theories tend to neglect the question of how early pragmatics or early communication can become more sophisticated throughout cognitive and pragmatic development. So the second aim of this talk is to try to incorporate the ostension problem within a broader developmental perspective and trying to move a first step toward addressing what we call the development problem. How do advanced communicative skills develop from early pragmatic and early communication if we assume that early communication can be based on minimalist abilities? And we want to propose a novel theoretical framework that seeks to address these two interrelated problems in a comprehensive manner. And this framework is called Redescribing early pragmatics. So on the one hand, we want to provide a minimalist view on early pragmatics and communication as based on simpler representation of implicit procedural knowledge. And on the other hand, we want to explore the possibility that communicative development could be driven by a developmental process of knowledge or representational redescription that can eventually explain the emergence of more advanced communicative skills in later stages of cognitive development. So this model is based on this notion of knowledge redescription that comes from Carl Melo-Smith and has been formulated in the 90s, who describe redescription as a developmental process by which implicit knowledge in the mind subsequently becomes explicit knowledge to the mind. So it's a developmental process, gradual developmental process from implicit to explicit knowledge. And the core insight behind this idea is that, according to her, infants' abilities are initially constrained by implicit representations of knowledge that can progressively be redescribed into more explicit format, thus making this early procedural knowledge more flexible, more manipulable, and eventually accessible to metacognition and verbalization. So we want to suggest that this framework can be fruitfully applied to take both the ostension and the development problem. But before looking at how we can talk about knowledge redescription in a domain of pragmatic development, let us first focus on the initial stages, so the lower bound for the basis for a possible developmental process of redescription. So Carl Melo-Smith suggested that early knowledge in infancy is fundamentally implicit and procedural, meaning that this knowledge is embedded into behavioral procedures for responding to external stimuli. And this kind of stimuli might involve, these kinds of procedures might involve attention biases towards specific stimuli or processing heuristic for computing those stimuli. And we think that this broad idea of early cognition as constrained by attention biases, early heuristic can find some interesting parallel with data from early pragmatics that show, on the one hand, early attention biases toward ostensive signals and ostensive marker, and on the other hand, early relevance heuristic for processing ostensive stimuli, for processing communicative stimuli. So these two sides kind of provide the basis for early pragmatics, what we call the two fundamental pillars of early pragmatics. The ostensive pillar, which is more based on the attentional behavioral procedures that tuning infants' attention towards the communicator, and what we call the inferential pillar, so the inferential procedures that help children to get the meaning from ostensive and communicative stimuli. So, of course, one of the important part is played by the inferential procedures in infants' pragmatic competence, but given that we want to focus on the ostensive problem, let us zoom in on the attentional procedures, on the ostensive pillar of early pragmatics. So empirical evidence show that infants have an early sensitivity to ostensive marker, which is manifested by behavioral patterns of preferential attention and enhanced processing whenever they are addressed ostensively. And we propose to spell out this spontaneous attentional reaction to ostension by way of the following attentional procedures. If C, the communicator, addressed ostensively, then preferentially attend to C. So this kind of describes the spontaneous attentional responses that infants have when addressed by ostensive marker. Now, to answer the question of how infants understand ostension, in our theoretical model, we should specify a principle of knowledge embedded within these attentional procedures. And in this regard, we draw on Nima's idea about according to which infants perceive ostensive signals as coded communicative markers without recruiting mentalistic inference to higher order intention. So basically our hypothesis, our proposal is that the pragmatic principle that ostension is a communication marker can plausibly describe the nature of the implicit knowledge which is embedded within the attentional procedures that tune in infants' attention toward the communicators in the early stage of pragmatics. Now, for what concerns the representation that might support this implicit knowledge, we propose that infants may represent ostension by way of what are called implicit sensory motor representation. So this is a notion which is slightly different from the classical notion of symbolic representation in cognitive science, in the sense that this sensory motor representation have a procedural format instead of having a propositional or conceptual format. And they are understood as internal instruction for efficient stimuli response. So this is a notion that comes from Carmelo Smith and has been applied also in the domain of ostensive communication by Juan Carlos Gomez. So we can think about this implicit sensory motor representation as a representation of an ostensive action which is built into the attentional procedures that describe infant spontaneous reaction to ostensive marker. So we propose that ostension in infancy may rely on this representation which are built into attentional procedures for responding to ostension. And this provides part of our minimalist hypothesis for conceptually describing the representation behind infants' recognition of ostensive marker as communicative. But as I have mentioned before, every minimalist view of early pragmatics should also try to face the development problems. So how do advanced communicative skills develop from early communication and early abilities? And we think that the notion of knowledge redescription, specifically this general idea of implicit knowledge that from being procedural gradually became more explicit and more flexible and manipulable throughout cognitive development, might be applied to explain the development of some communicative skills. And as a case study, we propose to focus on a specific ability in production, which is the ability of hidden authorship. So hidden authorship is a behavior in which an information is provided intentionally, but this intention to provide an information is concealed from the addressee. And this ability has been tested by looking at children's capacity to suppress their display of ostensive signals while attempting to transmitting an information. For instance, Gross's Scott Phillips and Tom Mazzarella tested 3 and 5 years old ability to share an information about the location of the missing piece of a puzzle with an adult who didn't want to receive any help to complete the puzzle. And their findings indicate that hidden authorship is already present by the age of 3 and significantly developed at the age of 5. So hidden authorship is particularly interesting to the present discussion about the meta-representation in the Gressian model, because it is typically described by way of an intentional structure, a meta-representation that matches with complexity the standard's communicative intention, with the difference that now we have an intention not to show that the communicators wants to provide an information. But in contrast, we suggest that hidden authorship in our framework can be explained without postulating complex meta-representation, but can emerge from a redescription of the implicit knowledge that ostension marks communication. So as I've said before, this principle of implicit knowledge in this framework has to be embedded in attentional procedures. If C addressed ostensively, then preferentially attend to C. Now the idea is that knowledge redescription in this case may lead to the possibility of teasing apart and manipulating the two components of this condition, so the antecedent and the consequence. And from a conceptual point of view, one of these two components are teased apart, they become also available and manipulable to be exploited by the cognitive system in order to inform strategies of covert information transmission, such as hidden authorship, to prevent the audience from attending to you, then suppress the ostension. So in other terms, we suggest that knowing more explicitly that ostension marks communication, and therefore that if I address the audience ostensively, the audience will reciprocate attention, can give a useful and effective solution in a hidden authorship task. So to prevent catching the audience attention while giving an helpful information, then suppress the naturally occurring ostensiveness of your behavior. So from this point of view, hidden authorship can be seen as a communicative phenomenon that emerged from the redescription of the implicit principle that ostension marks communication, and more specifically would be an instance of manipulation of this marking function of ostension in production. So it can be a representative communicative phenomenon that implicit knowledge has become more explicit to be exploited strategically in strategies of information transmission. So to conclude the talk, as a general take-home message that we want to put forward with this framework is that, in our view, facing the developmental challenge to undertaking that the aim of this symposium does not only have to do with providing a theoretically sound and empirically plausible account of early communication, but has fundamentally to do with also explaining how those early pragmatics, early competencies might evolve throughout cognitive development. And we have proposed to do that by focusing on this ostension problem, how the infants understand and represent ostension, and elaborating on this notion of sensory-motor representation of implicit communicative knowledge. And we also try to move a first step toward addressing the development problem by hypothesizing that knowledge redescription, meaning manipulability of implicit knowledge, can explain the later development of some sophisticated communicative skills such as hidden authorship. Thank you.
Have some time for questions. I see a hand here. On the left. Yeah.
Hello, thank you very much. So I really like this idea of things getting from more implicit, like they get more explicit. I like this. I don't see the link between these implicit sensory motor representations that create this attentional bias towards ostensive signals. So how do you see this link between implicit knowledge and attention at the early stages of pragmatics?
Yeah, so there are two ways to answer the question. One is thinking about redescription as a process in which it is the principle of implicit knowledge that undergoes a redescription. So in this case, the principle is ostension as a communication marker, and it becomes more explicitly represented in the cognitive system that can be exploited. The other proposal about the representation is more about the notion of representation that we use to explain infants' reaction to ostensive stimuli. So it's not a meta-representation of the speaker communicative intention, but we can use a different notion of representation in terms of implicit sensory motor, thinking about a representation of communicative knowledge which is just built into the ways through which infants react to ostensive stimuli. So just paying attention and then enhancing cognitive processing and pragmatic processing to get the meaning of the communicative signal. So if we should have to spell out in a verbal way, this sensory motor representation should be like a representation of you are communicating to me. So I'm representing this ostensive action as signally established communication, but without representing it as an expression of an higher order communicative intention.
So I'm just trying to rephrase what you just said to check if I understood. So is the idea that without explicit knowledge, so at the very beginning when things are still just implicit, then what I have as a baby is like I have just a bias towards certain signals because they are, by definition, when I'm born, these things are just super salient and so they grab my attention. Is that the idea?
Yeah, it's not properly. It's not just the idea of saliency.
Okay.
So what you have at the beginning is you know how to behave in ostensive case of a receptive communication, and then what I presented today was just one part of the model, because the other more prominent part is related to the expectation which are raised by communicative markers, ostensive markers, which are expectation of relevance. So this is the other pillar, but I haven't not focused on that. Okay. So it's not just a matter of saliency, but it's the matter of tuning attention and triggering some expectations of relevance of communication that then bring you to get the meaning and zeroing in the meaning which is communicated.
Thank you.
Thank you.
We still have time for a question.
Hi, thank you. Really interesting. I guess I want to ask you a little bit if you can say some more about the middle part. It seems to me that that's kind of the most critical bit. So, we have the implicit, or they have the implicit knowledge with disorienting bias, and then it becomes explicit. So how do you propose this knowledge redescription happens in the case of ostension? Also considering that, so if I look at this, the attentional bias, it's when the infant is addressed, right? Whereas if I understand correctly, what comes after is like how to use ostension, or maybe I misunderstand that part. But yeah, so can you say a bit more about how this sort of very critical bit can happen in the communicative domain?
Yeah, thank you for this question. So here we focused on the notricity, which is also a kind of later ability and is in production, while the implicit part is in comprehension. So about the possible cognitive abilities that might enter into this knowledge redescription process, we are kind of open, because knowledge redescription is better thought as a domain general process. And it's this domain general process then that might be different abilities that help to drive this process of knowledge redescription, like, I don't know, mentalistic abilities or abilities to attribute beliefs, or even like in the transition from the dyadic to the triadic stage of communication, abilities of joint attention. So yeah, our proposal is kind of uncommittal about the specific kind of cognitive abilities. It's just about trying to trace a general process that might explain this. And for what concerns the comprehension versus production abilities, I think that like having an explicit knowledge that ostension marked communication can also manifest in some behaviors in comprehension. For example, there are some nice studies run by Daniel Matthews about this phenomenon of pretending not to hear, in which they try to test the comprehension ability of making as if they have not received a request that they don't want to comply. And this is tested with 2 years old. So they haven't found really strong findings about that, but there are some questionnaire and parental report that show that basically parents say that they are able to pretend not to hear while they are addressed with a request that they don't want to comply. Like, for example, it's tied to nappy while they are playing. So we are kind of open about the different abilities that can be put in this model. Hope that is answered your question.
Okay, we should move on to the next talk. Let's thank Edoardo.